On the morning of March 14, 1978, Roger Whitman walked into Building 7 of Ford's Dearborn Assembly Complex and noticed that someone had moved the transmission schematics from the locked cabinet. The drawings were back in place, properly filed, cross-referenced according to standard protocol. Everything appeared normal. But Whitman had placed a single human hair across the cabinet door the night before. Pressed between the metal frame and the rubber seal, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, the hair was gone. Whitman was 43 years old, a senior mechanical engineer specializing in automatic transmission systems for Ford's light truck division. He had worked at the Dearborn facility for 19 years, ever since his discharge from the Army Corps of Engineers in 1959. He lived alone in a modest ranch house in Inkster, drove a 1974 F-150 that he had rebuilt himself, and spent most evenings at his kitchen table reviewing technical specifications for projects that would not see production for another 3 years. He was not paranoid by nature. He did not read spy novels. He had voted for Gerald Ford in 1976 primarily because of the man's association with Michigan and the automotive industry. He believed in systems, in documentation, in the integrity of engineering processes that had made American manufacturing the envy of the world. The missing hair meant someone had accessed classified design documents outside of authorized hours. It meant someone had bypassed the sign-out sheet that every engineer was required to complete when removing materials from the secure cabinet. It meant that, in a facility employing over 4,000 workers across multiple shifts, someone was operating outside the protocols that govern proprietary research and development. Whitman did not immediately report the incident. He returned to his desk in the open engineering bay, where 12 other specialists worked in rows of identical workstations, each separated by low partitions that allowed supervisors to maintain sightlines across the entire floor. He removed his jacket, hung it on the metal coat hook welded to the side of his desk, and began his standard morning review of overnight production reports from the assembly line. He drank coffee from a thermos he brought from home. He did not speak to anyone for the first 90 minutes of his shift. At 10:15, he walked to the secure cabinet and performed a complete inventory of the documents inside. There were 47 technical drawings related to the new C6 transmission variant Ford was developing for the 1980 model year F-Series trucks. The transmission represented a significant engineering advancement, incorporating a lock-up torque converter that would improve fuel efficiency by approximately 11% compared to existing models. In the context of the 1978 oil crisis and rising CAFE standards imposed by the federal government, this technology was worth approximately $30 million in research and development costs. It was also worth considerably more to any foreign automotive manufacturer attempting to close the technical gap with American engineering. Every document was present. Every page was accounted for. But on page 7 of drawing set C6 to 447B, which detailed the hydraulic valve body assembly, Whitman noticed a small grease smudge near the lower right corner. The smudge had not been there when he had reviewed the same drawing 3 days earlier. Whitman knew this with absolute certainty because he had spilled coffee on that exact drawing 2 weeks ago and had spent 40 minutes carefully cleaning the page with distilled water and lint-free cloth to avoid having to redraft the entire schematic. He had examined every millimeter of that document. There had been no grease smudge. Someone with mechanical hands had touched that page recently. Someone who worked with lubricants or assembly machinery. Someone who had not bothered to wash thoroughly before handling documents that were supposed to remain pristine. Whitman returned the drawings to the cabinet and locked it. He walked back to his desk and opened his personnel directory, a brown 3-ring binder containing photographs and basic information about every engineer and technician. Assigned to Building 7, he began reviewing the profiles of the 11 other men who had authorized access to the secure cabinet. He was looking for anyone who regularly worked with their hands, anyone whose job responsibilities included direct contact with greased components or assembly line machinery. The profile that stood out belonged to Dennis Carver. Carver was 31 years old, hired in 1974 as a liaison engineer responsible for coordinating between the design team and the production floor. His job required him to spend approximately half his time in the engineering bay reviewing technical specifications and the other half on the assembly line, ensuring that designs could be practically implemented by line workers. He had a degree in mechanical engineering from Wayne State University. His personnel file noted that he had briefly worked for Chrysler before joining Ford, a fact that was unremarkable in an industry where engineers frequently moved between the big three automakers. His security clearance had been processed without incident. His performance reviews were adequate, but not exceptional. He was described by his supervisor as competent, reliable, and appropriately focused on production efficiency rather than theoretical innovation. Whitman had worked alongside Carver for 4 years and had formed no particular opinion of the man. Carver was quiet, methodical, and generally kept to himself. He brought his lunch in a metal lunchbox. He did not participate in after-work gatherings at the bar across from the plant entrance. He drove a Dodge Dart, which several of the Ford engineers considered mildly traitorous but not worth commenting on. He had never volunteered information about his personal life. Whitman could not recall ever seeing Carver outside the facility. What Whitman did recall was that 3 weeks earlier he had stayed late to finish a stress analysis report and had seen Carver in the engineering bay at 7:45 in the evening, well after the day shift had ended. Carver had been standing at the secure cabinet with a ring of keys in his hand. When Whitman had asked if he needed assistance, Carver had explained that he was looking for a torque specification sheet that the production supervisor had requested for a morning meeting. Whitman had helped him locate the document, watched him make a photocopy at the Xerox machine near the entrance, and thought nothing more of it. Now, reviewing that memory with different assumptions, Whitman realized that Carver had taken nearly 6 minutes to make a single photocopy. The Xerox 3100 machine in Building 7 was new, installed just 4 months earlier, and could produce copies at a rate of 1 page every 2 seconds. A single-page document should have taken no more than 30 seconds to copy, even accounting for the machine's warm-up cycle. 6 minutes suggested that Carver had been copying multiple pages, possibly photographing documents with a camera, or simply standing at the machine while doing something else entirely. Whitman opened his desk drawer and removed a small spiral notebook he used for tracking project deadlines. He began documenting everything he could remember about Carver's behavior over the past 6 months. The list grew slowly, each entry unremarkable on its own, but collectively forming a pattern that troubled him. September 1977, Carver had asked detailed questions about the metallurgical composition of the new torque converter housing. Questions that seemed unrelated to his production liaison responsibilities. October 1977. Carver had volunteered to inventory the secure cabinet after the previous inventory clerk had been transferred to the Cleveland facility, a task that gave him unmonitored access to every document in the cabinet for approximately 3 hours. November 1977. Carver had been seen by a night janitor in Building 7 at 11:30 on a Saturday evening, explaining that he had forgotten his jacket and needed to retrieve it. Though the janitor had noted that Carver was carrying a briefcase when he left and had not been wearing a jacket when he arrived. January 1978, Carver had asked Whitman whether Ford maintained off-site backups of engineering documents and where those backups were stored. February 1978, Carver had inquired about the schedule for document destruction, specifically which drawings were slated to be incinerated after projects moved to production. None of these incidents had seemed significant at the time. Taken together, they suggested a man with unusual curiosity about document security and access protocols. Whitman closed the notebook and stared at the partition in front of his desk. The fabric was beige, neutral, designed to minimize distraction. He could hear the ambient noise of the engineering bay, the rustle of technical drawings, the occasional ring of desk phones, the low murmur of conversations about tolerances and specifications and production schedules. Everything was normal. Everything was exactly as it should be in a functioning industrial facility where Thousands of people collaborated to build vehicles that would be sold to millions of customers across the country. He did not want to believe that someone was stealing proprietary designs. He did not want to become the person who saw conspiracy in ordinary behavior, who destroyed a colleague's career based on grease smudges and circumstantial timing. He had no proof of wrongdoing. He had a missing hair and a smudge and a series of incidents that could be explained by professional diligence or simple curiosity. But Whitman had served in Army intelligence during the early years of the Cold War, assigned to a signals unit in West Germany that monitored Soviet military communications across the border. He had spent 2 years of his life learning to recognize patterns in noise, to identify the small inconsistencies that indicated someone was attempting to conceal information or manipulate communication protocols. He had been trained to understand that espionage was rarely dramatic, that it almost never involved gunfights or car chases or elaborate disguises. Real intelligence work was paperwork and patience and the slow accumulation of details that individually meant nothing but collectively revealed intention. The grease smudge bothered him because it indicated carelessness. If someone was accessing documents without authorization, they should have been meticulous about avoiding detection. The smudge suggested either incompetence or confidence, and Whitman suspected it was the latter. Someone who had been successfully accessing the secure cabinet for months might become complacent, might stop worrying about small traces of evidence because they had never been caught. At 11:30, Whitman walked to the employee cafeteria on the second floor of Building 7 and purchased a sandwich and a cup of coffee. He sat alone at a table near the windows overlooking the parking lot. From this vantage point, he could see rows of vehicles belonging to workers across all shifts, primarily Ford products, but also a significant number of Chevrolets, Dodges, and even a few imported Datsuns and Toyotas. The presence of foreign vehicles in a Ford parking lot was a source of ongoing tension. Though management had declined to implement any formal policy restricting employee vehicle choices, Carver's Dodge Dart was parked in the third row, a pale green sedan that Whitman estimated to be a 1973 or 1974 model. The vehicle appeared well-maintained, clean, unremarkable in every respect. Whitman watched it for several minutes, knowing that he was procrastinating, that he was avoiding the decision he would eventually have to make. If he reported his suspicions to plant security, an investigation would be initiated. Carver's access to secure documents would be suspended. His work would be scrutinized. His personal life would be examined. If Whitman was wrong, if there was an innocent explanation for everything he had observed, Carver's reputation would be damaged, possibly irreparably. In an industry where engineers moved between companies and relied on professional references, an unfounded accusation of industrial espionage could end a career. If Whitman was right, if Carver was indeed stealing designs and passing them to a foreign competitor or intelligence service, then every day of delay represented additional compromised technology, additional strategic advantage handed to adversaries who were already benefiting from decades of stolen American innovation. Whitman finished his sandwich and returned to the engineering bay. He spent the afternoon working on a comparative analysis of torque converter efficiency across different transmission configurations, a routine assignment that required minimal creative thought and allowed him to maintain the appearance of normal productivity while his mind worked through the implications of what he suspected. At 4:15, he watched Carver pack his briefcase and leave for the day. The briefcase was brown leather, worn at the corners, secured with 2 brass latches. It appeared to be the same briefcase Carver carried every day, though Whitman realized he had never paid particular attention to it before. He wondered what was inside. He wondered whether Carver was walking out of the facility at this moment with photographs of proprietary designs, with specifications that would be developed into products by engineers in Moscow or East Berlin, or wherever Soviet automotive research was being conducted. Whitman waited until 5:30 after most of the day shift had departed, then walked to the personnel office on the first floor of the administration building adjacent to Building 7. He asked to review Carver's employment file, explaining that he was considering Carver for a project team and wanted to verify his technical qualifications. The clerk, a middle-aged woman named Patricia, who had worked at Ford since before Whitman was hired, retrieved the file without question. Whitman sat in a small conference room and opened the manila folder. Inside was standard documentation, an employment application, copies of academic transcripts from Wayne State, reference letters from Chrysler supervisors, security clearance paperwork processed by Ford's internal security division. He read through each document carefully, looking for anything unusual, any detail that might confirm or dispel his suspicions. The security clearance form included a section requiring disclosure of foreign contacts and travel. Carver had indicated that he had traveled to Canada twice for fishing trips and had no foreign contacts requiring disclosure. The form was dated August 1974, just before his hire date. Whitman turned to the reference letters from Chrysler. Both were brief, professional, neither enthusiastic nor critical. They confirmed that Carver had worked as a junior engineer in transmission development and had left the company in good standing. There was no indication of why he had left, no explanation for the relatively short tenure of less than 2 years. The academic transcript showed solid but unexceptional grades, a B average across most courses, with slightly higher marks in practical engineering applications, and slightly lower marks in theoretical mathematics. Nothing suggested particular brilliance or particular weakness. Whitman returned the file to Patricia and walked back to Building 7. The evening shift had begun. The assembly line running at full capacity. The sound of pneumatic tools and moving machinery creating a constant industrial rhythm that Whitman had long since learned to ignore. He sat at his desk and stared at the secure cabinet across the room. He could set another trap, something more definitive than a hair across the door. He could mark specific pages with invisible ink or arrange documents in a sequence that would be impossible to replicate without detailed knowledge of his system. He could install a small camera, though that would require authorization he did not have and would likely violate company policy even if his suspicions were correct. Or he could simply ask Carver directly. The thought was absurd, reckless, completely contrary to every principle of operational security he had learned in the Army. If Carver was engaged in espionage, confronting him would only alert him to the fact that he was under suspicion. He would destroy evidence, alter his patterns, possibly flee. A direct confrontation was the worst possible approach. But Whitman was not an intelligence officer. He was an engineer in a civilian facility with no legal authority to investigate anyone. If he went to plant security with nothing more than a grease smudge and a series of circumstantial observations, they might take him seriously, or they might dismiss him as paranoid. If he went to the FBI, he would be asked why he had not reported his suspicions to his employer first. The proper channels were clear, but the proper channels were also slow, bureaucratic, and likely to result in exactly the kind of investigation that would alert Carver if he was in fact guilty. Whitman had no good options. He had only the choice between action and inaction, between the risk of being wrong and the risk of allowing something wrong to continue. He opened his desk drawer and removed a blank piece of Ford letterhead. He wrote a brief note in neat block letters, stating that he needed to speak with Carver about a technical matter related to the C6 transmission project and asking him to stop by his desk the following morning before the start of the shift. He walked to Carver's empty workstation 3 rows away and placed the note in the center of the desk where it could not be missed. Then he returned to his own desk, gathered his papers, locked the secure cabinet using his own key, and left the facility. He drove home through evening traffic. The radio tuned to a news station reporting on SALT II negotiations and grain embargo, discussions, and the ongoing crisis in Iran. The world was full of tensions he could not control, systems operating at scales far beyond his individual influence. But he could control what happened in Building 7. He could decide whether to act on what he suspected or to remain silent and hope that he was wrong. That night, Whitman sat at his kitchen table and wrote out everything he knew about Dennis Carver in precise chronological detail. He filled 4 pages of a legal pad with dates, times, observations, and unanswered questions. When he finished, he folded the pages and placed them in an envelope, which he sealed and addressed to himself. He applied a stamp and walked 3 blocks to the nearest mailbox, where he deposited the envelope into the slot. If something happened to him, if his suspicions led to consequences he could not predict, there would be at least one piece of documentation existing outside the facility, time-stamped by the Postal Service, proving that he had identified a pattern and attempted to address it. He returned home and sat in his living room with the lights off, watching headlights move past his window, thinking about grease smudges and missing hairs and all the small ways that systems failed when people stopped paying attention to details. The next morning, Carver was waiting at Whitman's desk when he arrived at 7:45. He was holding the note, his expression neutral, his posture relaxed. He asked what technical matter Whitman wanted to discuss. Whitman set down his thermos and his briefcase and looked at Carver for a long moment. Then he said, carefully, that he had noticed someone had been accessing the secure cabinet outside of normal procedures, and he wanted to make sure that proper protocols were being followed. Carver's expression did not change. He said that he had occasionally needed to reference documents in the evening when preparing materials for production meetings, and that he had always followed proper sign-out procedures. Whitman said that the sign-out sheet from the previous week showed no evening access. Carver said that he must have forgotten to sign out on one occasion and that he would be more careful in the future. Whitman said that he had found a grease smudge on one of the transmission drawings and was concerned about contamination of archival documents. Carver said that he had probably touched the document after working on the production floor and apologized for the carelessness. The conversation was quiet, civil, completely ordinary. 2 engineers discussing document management protocols in a facility where such discussions happen dozens of times each day. Nothing in Carver's demeanor suggested guilt or alarm. He maintained eye contact. His hands were steady. His voice was calm. Whitman felt himself beginning to doubt his own suspicions. Perhaps he had been wrong. Perhaps Carver was simply a conscientious engineer who occasionally bent minor rules in service of getting his work done efficiently. Perhaps the grease smudge and the missing hair and all the other small inconsistencies were exactly what they appeared to be, meaningless coincidences that meant nothing at all. Then Carver said something that changed everything. He said, almost as an afterthought, that he appreciated Whitman's attention to security protocols, and that, in his previous position at Chrysler, he had worked on a project involving document security upgrades after the company had experienced some issues with proprietary information being mishandled. Whitman asked what kind of issues. Carver hesitated just for a fraction of a second, then said that he did not know the specific details, only that management had become more strict about access procedures and sign-out requirements. Whitman thanked him for his time and said that he was satisfied that there was no ongoing problem. Carver returned to his own desk. Whitman sat down and opened his notebook to a fresh page. He wrote down exactly what Carver had just said, word for word, as precisely as he could remember. Then he picked up his phone and dialed the internal extension for Ford's security division. When the officer answered, Whitman identified himself and said that he needed to report a potential security concern related to proprietary engineering documents. The officer asked him to hold. There was a click, a brief pause, and then a different voice came on the line, deeper, more formal. This voice identified itself as belonging to Thomas Hendricks, Chief of Industrial Security for the Dearborn Complex. Whitman explained what he had observed. He kept his tone factual, unemotional, presenting each detail as a discrete piece of information without drawing conclusions. He mentioned the hair, the grease smudge, the evening access, the questions about document storage and destruction protocols. He mentioned Carver's comment about security issues at Chrysler. Hendricks listened without interrupting. When Whitman finished, there was a long pause. Then Hendricks asked Whitman if he would be willing to come to the security office immediately to provide a formal statement. Whitman said that he would. Hendricks said that he should bring any documentation related to his observations, and that he should not discuss this matter with anyone else in the facility. Whitman gathered his notebook, locked his desk, and walked across the complex to the security office, a windowless building adjacent to the main gate where all employees entered and exited the facility each day. He had been inside once before, years ago, to process his initial security clearance. The interior was institutional, government-like, more similar to a police station than a corporate office. Hendricks was waiting in a small conference room. He was approximately 50 years old, gray-haired, wearing a dark suit that looked more appropriate for a federal building than an automotive plant. He shook Whitman's hand and asked him to sit down. For the next 3 hours, Whitman repeated everything he had told Hendricks on the phone, answering questions, clarifying timelines, describing Carver's behavior in exhaustive detail. Hendricks took notes in a leather-bound notebook, occasionally asking Whitman to repeat specific phrases or confirm specific dates. When they finished, Hendricks asked Whitman whether he had discussed his suspicions with anyone else. Whitman said that he had not, except for mailing himself a written summary the previous evening. Hendricks asked why he had done that. Whitman said that he wanted documentation to exist outside the facility in case something happened to him. Hendricks looked at him for a long moment, then said that Whitman had made the right decision to come forward and that the matter would be investigated thoroughly. He said that Whitman should return to his normal duties and should not alter his behavior toward Carver in any way. He said that Whitman should not mention this conversation to anyone, including his supervisor, and that he should contact Hendricks immediately if he observed any additional unusual behavior. Whitman returned to Building 7. It was nearly noon. The engineering bay was busy, engineers moving between desks, conversations about production schedules and material specifications filling the air. Carver was at his desk, working on what appeared to be a technical drawing, his posture relaxed, his focus apparently complete. Whitman sat down at his own desk and tried to resume work on the torque converter analysis he had been preparing. His hands were shaking slightly. He realized that he had just initiated a process that might destroy a man's career, a man he knew almost nothing about, a man whose guilt or innocence he could not definitively prove. He also realized that if his suspicions were correct, he had just prevented potentially millions of dollars in proprietary technology from being transferred to entities that would use it to compete against American industry and undermine American strategic interests. He did not know which reality he was living in. He would not know for days, possibly weeks, possibly longer. All he could do was return to his work and wait for the system to function as it was designed to function. Slowly, methodically, with the impersonal efficiency that characterized every institutional process in the modern industrial state. For 3 days, nothing happened. Whitman worked his normal schedule, reviewed his normal assignments, participated in his normal meetings. Carver continued to arrive at 7:30 each morning, continued to divide his time between the engineering bay and the production floor, continued to pack his worn leather briefcase at 4:15 each afternoon, and walked to his pale green Dodge Dart in the parking lot. The routine was undisturbed, the rhythm of the facility unchanged. To any observer, Building 7 of the Ford Dearborn complex functioned exactly as it had functioned for years. Thousands of workers coordinating across multiple shifts to design and produce vehicles that would roll off assembly lines and into American driveways. On the 4th day, a Thursday in late March, Whitman noticed 2 men in dark suits walking through the engineering bay at 9:15 in the morning. They were not Ford employees. Their shoes were too formal, their posture too rigid, their eyes too deliberate in their scanning of the workspace. They stopped briefly at the supervisor's desk, spoke quietly with him for less than a minute, then walked to Carver's workstation. Whitman could not hear the conversation. He watched from his desk 3 rows away as Carver stood, said something brief in response to a question, then gathered his briefcase and jacket and followed the 2 men out of the engineering bay. The entire interaction took less than 90 seconds. Carver's expression was unreadable, neutral. The same expression he wore when discussing production schedules or transmission tolerances. The supervisor, a man named Miller who had worked at Ford for 26 years and rarely showed emotion about anything, stood at his desk and watched them leave. Then he walked to Whitman's workstation and said quietly that Whitman should come to his office. Miller's office was a small room with a window overlooking the parking lot. The same parking lot Whitman had observed from the cafeteria days earlier. Miller closed the door and told Whitman to sit down. He said that plant security had informed him that morning that Dennis Carver was being questioned in connection with a potential security violation, and that Whitman had initiated the inquiry. He said that he was not being given details about the investigation, but that he needed to know whether Whitman's concerns were serious enough to justify the disruption this would cause to the engineering team. Whitman said that his concerns were serious. Miller asked whether Whitman had actual evidence or only suspicions. Whitman said that he had observed patterns of behavior that suggested unauthorized access to proprietary documents and that he had reported these observations to security, as he was required to do under company policy. Miller sat back in his chair and looked at Whitman for a long time. Then he said that Carver had been a reliable member of the team for 4 years, that his work had been satisfactory, that there had never been any complaints about his performance or his conduct. He said that if this investigation proved to be unfounded, it would create significant problems for team morale and might expose the company to legal liability. Whitman said he understood. Miller said that he hoped Whitman was certain about what he was doing. Whitman said that he was as certain as he could be given the information available to him. Miller dismissed him. Whitman returned to his desk and spent the rest of the day attempting to focus on technical work while wondering what was happening in whatever room Carver had been taken to, what questions were being asked, what answers were being given. At 4 o'clock, Hendricks called Whitman's desk phone and asked him to come to the security office. Whitman walked across the complex, signed in at the reception desk, and was escorted to the same conference room where he had given his initial statement 3 days earlier. Hendricks was sitting at the table with another man, younger, wearing a navy suit and a plain tie. Hendricks introduced the man as Special Agent Robert Kelso from the FBI's Detroit field office. Kelso shook Whitman's hand and asked him to sit down. Kelso said that the Bureau had been conducting an investigation into potential technology transfer to foreign entities operating within the automotive industry, and that Whitman's report had provided information relevant to that investigation. He said that Dennis Carver was currently being interviewed by federal agents and that Whitman's cooperation would be appreciated in helping to establish the full scope of Carver's activities. Whitman asked whether Carver had admitted to anything. Kelso said that he could not discuss the details of an ongoing investigation, but that preliminary findings suggested Whitman's concerns had been justified. Whitman felt something shift in his chest, a combination of relief and dread. Relief that he had not destroyed an innocent man's career over paranoid suspicions. Dread at the implications of what justified concerns actually meant. Kelso asked Whitman to describe again, in complete detail, every interaction he had ever had with Dennis Carver, every conversation, every technical discussion, every moment when Carver had asked questions or expressed interest in documents or procedures. The questioning lasted 2 hours. Kelso took notes in a small government tissue notebook, occasionally asking Whitman to clarify timing or repeat specific phrases that Carver had used. When they finished, Kelso said that Whitman had performed a valuable service to his country and that the information he had provided would be instrumental in preventing further compromise of American industrial technology. He said that the investigation was classified and that Whitman was legally prohibited from discussing any aspect of it with anyone, including his family, his colleagues, or his supervisor. He said that violating this restriction could result in federal prosecution. Whitman signed a non-disclosure agreement that Kelso produced from his briefcase. The document was 2 pages long, dense with legal language, printed on official FBI letterhead. Whitman read it carefully before signing, noting the sections that outlined potential criminal penalties for unauthorized disclosure of information related to counterintelligence operations. He returned to Building 7. The day shift was ending, engineers packing their materials and heading toward the parking lot. Carver's desk was empty, his workstation cleared of personal items, his nameplate removed from the partition. It was as if he had never existed, as if the space he had occupied for 4 years had been instantly sterilized of any trace of his presence. Whitman gathered his own materials and drove home through evening traffic. The radio was reporting on negotiations between Egypt and Israel at Camp David, on inflation rates that continued to exceed 8%, on energy policy debates in Congress. The world continued to function, systems operating at scales that made individual lives seem insignificant. Over the following weeks, Whitman learned fragments of what had happened, pieces of information assembled from brief conversations with Hendricks and occasional questions from FBI agents who appeared periodically at the facility to interview other engineers who had worked with Carver. The story that emerged was both more complex and more mundane than Whitman had imagined. Dennis Carver had been recruited by Soviet intelligence services while working at Chrysler in 1973. Approximately 1 year after his graduation from Wayne State University. The recruitment had not occurred in Moscow or East Berlin or any location suggestive of classic Cold War espionage. It had occurred in a shopping mall parking lot in suburban Detroit, where Carver had been approached by a man claiming to represent a European automotive consulting firm interested in obtaining technical specifications for American transmission systems. The man had offered Carver $500 for copies of non-classified design documents from Chrysler's development archive. Carver, who was earning $18,000 annually as a junior engineer and struggling with student loan debt, had agreed. The transaction had been simple, straightforward, apparently legal. Carver had provided photocopies of documents that were not marked as proprietary or confidential. He had received $500 in cash. He had been told that the consulting firm might contact him again if they needed additional technical information. 6 months later, the same man had contacted Carver and requested more specific documents, offering $1,000. Carver had provided them. Another 6 months passed, another contact, another request, another payment. By the time Carver left Chrysler and joined Ford in 1974, he had been providing technical documents to what he still believed was a legitimate European consulting firm for over a year. The FBI's reconstruction of events suggested that Carver had not known he was working for Soviet intelligence until sometime in late 1975 or early 1976, approximately 18 months after joining Ford. At that point, his handler had informed him that the consulting firm was in fact a front organization and that the documents he had been providing were being used by entities within the Soviet automotive and military-industrial complex. The handler had explained that Carver was now compromised, that evidence existed proving he had knowingly sold proprietary American technology to foreign nationals, and that his cooperation would need to continue if he wanted to avoid federal prosecution. This was the standard pattern of Soviet industrial espionage in the 1970s. A methodology refined over decades of operations targeting American technology sectors. Identify individuals with access to valuable information and financial vulnerabilities. Approach them with seemingly legitimate opportunities. Gradually increase the sensitivity of requested materials. Reveal the true nature of the relationship only after the individual is sufficiently compromised to be controlled through blackmail. Carver had continued providing documents to his handler throughout his employment at Ford. The meetings occurred monthly, sometimes in parking lots, sometimes in public parks, once in the food court of a regional shopping center. Carver would bring photocopies or photographs of technical drawings. The handler would bring cash, usually between $1,000 and $3,000, depending on the perceived value of the materials. The exchanges lasted less than 5 minutes. No dramatic tradecraft was employed. No dead drops or coded messages or elaborate surveillance detection routes. The operation relied on the simple fact that 2 men meeting, briefly in a public location, attracted no attention whatsoever in suburban America. The FBI estimated that over the course of 4 years, Carver had provided Soviet intelligence with approximately 400 separate technical documents related to automatic transmission systems, engine design specifications, fuel injection technology, and metallurgical research into lightweight alloys for automotive applications. The total value of the compromised technology was estimated to be in excess of $100 million in research and development costs. The Soviet Union did not have a significant consumer automotive industry in 1978. The vehicles produced by factories in Moscow and Gorky and Togliatti were crude by American standards, inefficient years behind Western design philosophy. But the same transmission technology that improved fuel efficiency in civilian trucks could be adapted for military vehicles. The same lightweight alloys used in consumer automobiles could be used in armored personnel carriers. The same fuel injection systems that met American emission standards could be reverse-engineered for Soviet military applications. Every document Carver had provided represented a shortcut, a way for Soviet engineers to avoid years of research and testing by simply copying solutions that American engineers had already developed. In the context of the Cold War arms race, in an era when military readiness depended on logistical efficiency and fuel consumption and the ability to move troops and equipment across vast distances, automotive technology was strategic technology. Carver was arrested on March 23, 1978. Approximately 6 hours after being escorted from Building 7 by FBI agents. He was charged with violating the Economic Espionage Act, a federal statute that carried a maximum penalty of 15 years imprisonment. His attorney, a public defender assigned by the court, negotiated a plea agreement in which Carver would provide complete cooperation with the FBI's investigation in exchange for a reduced sentence. The cooperation included detailed debriefings about his handler's identity, appearance, and methods of contact. It included a complete accounting of every document he had provided and every payment he had received. It included participation in a controlled meeting with his handler, arranged by the FBI, during which Carver wore a concealed recording device and attempted to elicit information about the broader Soviet intelligence network operating in the Detroit area. The handler did not appear at the meeting. He had apparently been alerted to Carver's arrest through some channel. The FBI never identified and had immediately ceased all operations and left the country. Subsequent investigations suggested that the handler was likely a GRU officer operating under diplomatic cover at the Soviet consulate in Detroit, though his true identity was never conclusively established. Carver was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. He served 6 years before being released on parole in 1984. Upon release, he was prohibited from working in any position that required security clearance or access to proprietary technical information. The FBI's records indicated that he found employment as a parts manager at an auto supply store in suburban Cleveland and lived quietly until his death from lung cancer in 1993 at the age of 46. Whitman learned most of these details gradually, over months and years, through occasional conversations with Hendricks and through a single long debriefing session with FBI counterintelligence specialists, who wanted to understand how Whitman had identified the anomalies in Carver's behavior. The specialists were particularly interested in the hair across the cabinet door, a technique that demonstrated awareness of surveillance principles unusual in a civilian engineer. Whitman explained his background in Army intelligence, his time in West Germany monitoring Soviet communications, his training in pattern recognition and anomaly detection. The specialists asked whether he would be willing to serve as a consultant to the FBI's industrial security program, helping to train corporate security personnel in techniques for identifying potential insider threats. Whitman declined. He said that he was an engineer, not an investigator, and that he had only done what he believed was necessary to protect his employer's proprietary information. He said that he wanted to return to his normal work and forget that any of this had happened. But forgetting proved impossible. The investigation had altered something fundamental in how Whitman understood his environment. Building 7 no longer felt like a benign space where engineers collaborated on technical problems. It felt like a battleground where invisible forces competed for advantage, where every colleague was potentially an adversary, where trust was a vulnerability that could be exploited by sophisticated intelligence. Services operating with patience and long-term strategic vision. Whitman found himself studying his colleagues with new suspicion, noting who worked late, who asked unusual questions, who seemed too interested in documents outside their direct responsibilities. He knew this was paranoia, knew that the overwhelming majority of people around him were exactly what they appeared to be, ordinary professionals doing ordinary work. But the knowledge that one person among thousands had been systematically betraying the company for years made it difficult to accept surface appearances at face value. The stress manifested physically. Whitman developed persistent insomnia, lying awake in his bedroom in Inkster and reviewing the day's interactions, wondering whether he had missed some signal, some indication that another Carver was operating in the facility. His performance reviews remained satisfactory, but his supervisor noted that he seemed distracted, less engaged with collaborative projects, more withdrawn from team discussions. In 1980, Whitman requested and received a transfer to Ford's testing facility in Arizona, a smaller operation focused on desert climate durability evaluation. The work was more solitary, involving long days supervising vehicle tests in extreme heat conditions, documenting performance data, analyzing mechanical failures. There were fewer people, fewer opportunities for espionage, fewer reasons to worry about who was accessing which documents. He remained in Arizona until his retirement in 1994. He never married. He maintained minimal contact with former colleagues from Dearborn. He did not attend company reunions or industry conferences. He lived in a small house on the outskirts of Phoenix and spent his retirement years restoring antique engines that he purchased from salvage yards and estate sales. In 2001, a researcher from the Cold War International History Project at the Woodrow Wilson Center contacted Whitman and asked whether he would be willing to be interviewed about his role in identifying Dennis Carver as a Soviet intelligence asset. The researcher explained that newly declassified documents from both American and Soviet archives had revealed the extent of industrial espionage operations conducted by the GRU and KGB throughout the 1970s, and that Whitman's case represented one of the few instances where an insider threat had been detected and neutralized before catastrophic damage occurred. Whitman agreed to a single interview conducted at his home in Arizona over the course of an afternoon. He described the grease smudge, the missing hair, the pattern of small inconsistencies that had accumulated into suspicion. He described the decision to confront Carver, the conversation that had seemed so ordinary and so wrong simultaneously. He described the doubt he had felt, the fear that he was destroying a man's life based on insufficient evidence. The researcher asked whether Whitman believed he had done the right thing. Whitman said that he did not know. He said that Carver had committed crimes and deserved to be punished according to law. He said that preventing the transfer of technology to the Soviet Union had been important for national security. But he also said that Carver had been trapped by circumstances, manipulated by professionals who understood human vulnerability and financial desperation, turned into a criminal by a system that offered him money when he needed it and blackmail when he tried to stop. The researcher asked whether Whitman had ever spoken with Carver after his arrest. Whitman said that he had not, that he had deliberately avoided any contact, that he had not wanted to know whether Carver blamed him or understood him or had any feelings about him at all. The researcher asked whether Whitman had regrets. Whitman said that he regretted living in a world where such things were necessary, where engineers could not simply focus on solving technical problems without worrying about whether their colleagues were selling secrets to foreign powers. He said that the Cold War had corrupted everything it touched, had turned ordinary professional relationships into potential security threats, had made trust impossible and suspicion mandatory. The interview was transcribed and archived. A brief summary appeared in an academic paper about industrial espionage during the Cold War, published in a journal with limited circulation. Whitman's name appeared in a footnote, identified only as a Ford Motor Company engineer who had detected anomalous behavior in a colleague and reported it to appropriate authorities. Whitman died in 2006 at the age of 71. His obituary in the Phoenix newspaper noted his 40-year career in automotive engineering and his service in the United States Army, but made no mention of the Carver case or his role in counterintelligence operations. His estate consisted primarily of the small house in Phoenix and a garage full of restored engines that were sold at auction to collectors who had no knowledge of the man who had rebuilt them. The secure cabinet in Building 7 of the Ford Dearborn complex remained in use until 1997, when digital document management systems made physical storage of engineering drawings obsolete. The cabinet was removed during a facility renovation and sold as surplus equipment to a used office furniture dealer. Its final disposition is unknown. The C6 transmission that Whitman had been working on when he discovered Carver's Espionage entered production in 1979 and remained in use in various Ford truck models until 1996. The lock-up torque converter technology that had been among the documents Carver provided to Soviet intelligence was eventually adopted by automotive manufacturers worldwide, through legitimate licensing agreements and independent development, becoming standard equipment in millions of vehicles. The shopping mall where Carver had first been approached by his Soviet handler was demolished in 2004 and replaced by a mixed-use development containing luxury apartments and retail space. No historical marker indicates that espionage operations were conducted in its parking lot during the Cold War. The FBI's Detroit field office continued to investigate industrial espionage cases throughout the 1980s and 1990s, focusing particularly on automotive and aerospace technology transfer to Soviet and later Russian intelligence services. The number of cases declined significantly after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Though operations by Russian, Chinese, and other foreign intelligence services continued at reduced levels. Thomas Hendricks, the Ford security chief who had received Whitman's initial report, retired in 1985 and died in 1998. Special Agent Robert Kelso, the FBI investigator who had interviewed Whitman, retired in 2002 after a 30-year career in counterintelligence. Neither man left memoirs or published accounts of their work. The final disposition of Dennis Carver's case file remains classified. Freedom of Information Act requests submitted by researchers and journalists have been partially granted, releasing heavily redacted documents that confirm the basic facts of the case but withhold details about intelligence methods, sources, and the broader investigation into Soviet industrial espionage networks operating in the American automotive sector during the 1970s. In 2015, a Russian automotive historian published an article in a Moscow technical journal analyzing the development of Soviet military vehicle transmission systems during the 1970s and 1980s. The article noted that Soviet engineers had achieved significant improvements in fuel efficiency and reliability during this period, narrowing the technical gap with Western designs. The article made no mention of espionage or technology transfer, attributing the advances to the skill and dedication of Soviet research teams working under difficult conditions with limited resources. The truth, as always in matters of intelligence and counterintelligence, exists in fragments scattered across archives and memories and documents that will remain classified for decades. What can be stated with certainty is that Roger Whitman noticed a grease smudge on a technical drawing in March 1978. That this observation led to the arrest and conviction of a Soviet intelligence asset operating inside the American automotive industry, and that the technology transfer that had been occurring for 4 years was terminated. Whether this mattered in the larger context of the Cold War is impossible to determine. The Soviet Union did not collapse because it lacked access to American transmission technology. The arms race did not turn on fuel efficiency improvements in military trucks. But every small victory in the hidden war mattered to those who fought it. Every prevented theft of technology represented a small preservation of American strategic advantage. Every identified insider threat was one fewer vulnerability in systems designed to protect innovation and maintain competitive superiority. Whitman understood this in the abstract, but experienced it personally as loss. The loss of trust. The loss of the simple professional satisfaction that had characterized his work before he learned that colleagues could be enemies. The loss of innocence about the nature of industrial collaboration in an era when economic competition and military rivalry were inseparable. He spent the final years of his life working alone in a garage in Arizona, rebuilding engines that had been manufactured before the Cold War began. Before espionage became routine, before every technical drawing had to be locked in secure cabinets, and every colleague had to be viewed with suspicion. The engines were simple, mechanical, honest in their function. They had no secrets. They performed exactly as they were designed to perform, without deception, without hidden purpose. This was all Whitman wanted from the world. Mechanical honesty. Systems that functioned transparently. Work that did not require him to doubt the motivations of the people around him. He never achieved it. No one who lived through the Cold War achieved it. The era demanded suspicion, rewarded paranoia, made betrayal ordinary, and trust naive. It was a machinery that ground down individuals who tried to maintain integrity while operating within institutions that had learned to assume duplicity as baseline reality. If stories like this make you rethink how close ordinary life came to being infiltrated by forces most people never saw, consider what lessons remain unlearned. These are not just historical curiosities. They are reminders that systems fail when people stop paying attention to small details, when grease smudges go unnoticed, when inconsistencies are dismissed as meaningless. The Cold War ended, but the methods it perfected continue, adapted to new contexts, new technologies, new forms of competition between nations and corporations. Roger Whitman noticed something wrong and did something about it. The cost was a career shadowed by doubt and a retirement marked by isolation. The benefit was measured in documents that were not stolen, in technology that was not transferred, in small advantages preserved for a country he believed deserved his loyalty. Whether that trade was worth making is a question each person must answer for themselves. Knowing that the world contains both heroes and victims, and that Whitman was, like most people who find themselves caught in larger conflicts, entirely both.